Hello, fellow teachers. Welcome to Teaching with Power. This is Ben Wilcox, and it's always a pleasure to join you each week for a deep dive into the Scriptures, wherever you're listening or watching. And I'm happy to join you on your walk, your commute, at the gym, or just studying at home. And thank you for taking the time to study or prepare your lessons with me. This week, Genesis 28 through 33 is going to be our Scripture block. And remember that my goal is to help you teach or study the Scriptures with more relevancy and power. So grab your Scriptures and your marking pencils. It's time to dig deep. And a quick note, you may wonder why I don't mention Jacob's dream of the stairway to heaven at Bethel this week. And that's because we already covered most of Genesis 28 a few weeks ago when we compared Jacob's vision of the stairway to heaven to the Tower of Babel story. So I encourage you to go back to the Genesis 6 through 11 lesson if you want to cover those verses. But to get us going this week, as an icebreaker, I like to ask my students the following question. How do you know when you're in love? If you're teaching the youth, you may even consider showing this short YouTube clip of the top 10 Disney love at first sight moments. Now, it doesn't matter if you're teaching youth or the adults. This can usually make for a fun discussion. But as they give their answers, I divide them up into two different lists, because I believe that there are actually two different forms or parts of, or manifestations of love. You have love, the feeling, and you have love, the action. Love, the noun, or love, the verb. Or another way to put it is to make a distinction between affection and love. And so on the one side, when they say things like, your heart starts racing, you can't stop thinking about them, staring at them with googly eyes, excitement, holding hands, kissing, even sexual intimacy. All of these things are a part of the affection side of love. Love, the feeling, or the noun. And those aren't bad things at all. Affection is a wonderful part of love and can often be the catalyst that leads to relationships of real love, or helps real love to flourish and endure. But when your students say things like sacrifice, spending time with, working through problems together, compromise, serving, those are the kinds of things that I would put on the other list. Then after they've made a number of those comments, you can explain why you divided their answers into those two lists and label one side affection and the other side love. Now, there's a lot of different things that your students might say in response to that question. So as a teacher, you're going to have to use your judgment in deciding which list each of the comments falls under. But after a few minutes of brainstorming, you can explain why you made the two lists and the difference between the two types of love. Perhaps the most eloquent explanation I've ever heard about this distinction comes from C.S. Lewis, and here's how he described it. Being in love is a good thing, but it is not the best thing. There are many things below it, but there are also things above it. You cannot make it the basis of a whole life. It is a noble feeling, but it is still a feeling. Now, no feeling can be relied on to last in its full intensity or even to last at all. Knowledge can last, principles can last, habits can last, but feelings come and go. And in fact, whatever people say, the state called being in love usually does not last. If the old fairy tale ending, they lived happily ever after, is taken to mean they felt for the next 50 years exactly as they felt the day before they were married, then it says what probably never was nor ever could be true, and would be highly undesirable if it were. Who could bear to live in that excitement for even 5 years? What would become of your work, your appetite, your sleep, your friendships? But, of course, ceasing to be in love need not mean ceasing to love. Love in the second sense, love as distinct from being in love, is not merely a feeling. It is a deep unity, maintained by the will and deliberately strengthened by habit, reinforced by, in Christian marriages, the grace which both parents ask and receive from God. They can have this love for each other, even at those moments when they do not like each other, as you love yourself even when you do not like yourself. They can retain this love even when each would easily, if they allowed themselves, be in love with someone else. Being in love first moved them to promise fidelity. This quieter love enables them to keep the promise. It is on this love that the engine of marriage is run. Being in love was the explosion that started it. Well, I feel that it's important for all, especially the youth, to understand this distinction, because the adversary has deceived many a person by convincing them that love is a feeling, only a feeling. He wants people to think that all love is affection and all affection is love. And you can probably guess why. If love is only a feeling, and intense feelings don't last forever, like C.S. Lewis just taught us, then what is likely to happen to those relationships? They won't last either. And that's a serious problem for a religion that believes in eternal marriages and families. Relationships that last are very important in our faith and a great source of happiness and peace. And Satan wishes to do everything he can to destroy those bonds and the happiness that they bring. And so, when time has passed, we may conclude, wow, why don't I feel the same way about this person that I once did? My feelings are not as intense. I don't feel the same passion and attraction for them that I did when we first met. I guess I don't love them anymore. I suppose I need to go out and find somebody else that makes me feel that way, which they usually can. And therefore, many people go through life jumping from relationship to relationship or marriage to marriage, sadly never actually experiencing real love. They have only felt affection, which is really tragic. Broken covenants, broken marriages, broken families, and broken societies can all stem from a lack of understanding of true or real love. So today we're going to take a look at two different love stories that illustrate this principle. We're going to look at two different couples and decide whether they're an example of real love or false love. Our two couples are Shechem and Dinah and Jacob and Rachel. And we'll start with the Shechem and Dinah story. Now I know that this story appears in Genesis chapter 34, so it's not really a part of this week's scripture block. But the comparison and the contrast is so perfect that I really felt it fits better with this week's lesson. And to introduce the Shechem and Dinah story, I like to help my students understand the concept of weasel words. And that's a term that was coined by Teddy Roosevelt. Weasel words are words that suck out the meaning of all the words that are around them. Like a weasel sucks all the contents of an egg out, leaving only the shell. And he used that term when his political opponents proposed what they called a universal voluntary draft. What's the weasel word? Well, voluntary and universal don't really fit together, do they? And a draft is anything but voluntary. Weasel words are particularly popular in advertising. And maybe you've heard some of these phrases before. Have you ever heard a product described as new and improved? Well, what's that supposed to mean? How can something be both new and improved at the same time? If it's new, it hasn't had a chance to become improved yet. Sometimes a product touts that it has been clinically tested. Okay, but what was proven? What was concluded? What did the tests reveal? Was it good or bad? Does the product really work as claimed? The fact that it's been tested doesn't really tell me anything about the product itself. I've heard commercials telling me that there is more goodness in every bite of some particular food. Well, how do you measure goodness? What does that goodness consist of? Isn't good a subjective term? And I love it when I hear that more people than ever are using a certain product. Well, what does that mean in terms of real numbers? Maybe there were only 2 people using it before, and now there's 3. More people than ever are using it, right? Well, let's apply that same idea to this story of Shechem and Dinah. Look in the following verses for all the words that describe the way that Shechem felt about Jacob's daughter Dinah. Look in verses 3, 8, and 19. How is it described? His soul clave unto Dinah. He loved the damsel. He spake kindly to her. In verse 8, we learn that the soul of Shechem longed for Dinah. And from verse 19, he had delight in Jacob's daughter. Now, at first glance, I admit that this looks like a positive relationship. Those are great descriptions. Sounds genuine. But we haven't read verse 2 yet. There's a weasel word that sucks the meaning out of all those other words and phrases that we've just taken a look at. Can you find it? And when Shechem the son of Hamor, the Hivite, prince of the country, saw her, Dinah, he took her and lay with her and defiled her. What's the weasel word? Defiled. This is not really a love story. It doesn't matter how nice and positive he describes his feelings for her after this initial action. I have no doubt that Shechem was attracted to Dinah, but he didn't really love her. The way that relationship is introduced seems devoid of meaning and emotion. It's just matter of fact. He saw, he took, he defiled. And we see no indication of Dinah's consent or interest in this relationship. And I want to be clear in saying that I don't see any wrongdoing attributed to her in the story. She does absolutely nothing wrong, as far as I can tell. The blame falls squarely on Shechem's shoulders. So anyone who has been the victim of this kind of tragic circumstance need not feel any guilt, impurity, or responsibility. They remain just as morally clean as anybody else. In fact, her brothers describe their abhorrence of the situation by saying, "Should he deal with our sister as with an harlot?" Now the brothers do something very, very wrong and unjustified themselves in reaction to the situation at the end of the chapter. Perhaps we'll take a look at that next week. I think there's a principle there. But based on this apparent, intense, and quick rush to sexual intimacy, what would you say Shechem was really feeling for Dinah? This isn't a love story at all. It's a lust story. Lust is Satan's counterfeit for love. Many a sexual sin has been excused in the name of love, which is unfortunate because usually love has nothing to do with it. Real love. Oftentimes when people have given in to fornication or adultery, they try to justify it by saying, "But we're in love." It's a lie. And we need go no further than Romans 13:10 to discover why. This verse contains the best definition of love that I've ever found. It says, "Love worketh no ill to his neighbor." Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. So how do we know if our actions are truly motivated by love? Only if they work no ill. So I would confront Shechem by asking, "So, you really love Dinah, do you? Does love defile or force somebody else?" No, that would be working ill. What you were feeling for Dinah was not love. Other questions we might consider: does love fill a soul with guilt? Does love close the doors of the temple on a couple? Does love have to coerce the other person into doing something that they don't want to do? Does love intentionally hurt the other person, either emotionally or physically? Does love make us feel unworthy? Does love break up homes? Does love take children from a parent? No, love does none of these things because love worketh no ill. So if our actions are causing these kinds of results, we can know that what we're feeling, or what someone else claims they're feeling for us, is not really love. At best, it's merely affection, and at worst, lust. If anyone ever tries to push you into doing something that you don't feel comfortable doing by pleading, "But don't you love me?" run, right? Because rest assured that that person does not love you. The world has a lie that it has been selling for decades through the media. It's a devilish doctrine that's continually preached from the screens and magazine pages of the modern Babylon we live in. You find this message in movies, in books, television programs, it's even in commercials. And I'm pretty sure we all know what it is. What is the message sent, even if it's not explicit or graphic, about what unmarried people do when they're in love with each other to show that they're really in love? And pardon my directness, they have sex. They become intimate with each other. The world says that is how you show love. That is how the relationship is strengthened. But it's a lie. When people take that most sacred and personal of unions, which is a beautiful and unifying thing within the bonds of the long-term commitment of marriage, preceding it, and cheapen it with casualness or haste, I believe that it more often than not weakens the relationship or eventually even destroys the bond between those two people. I've even seen statistics that show that's the case. I like this quote from Gordon B. Hinckley, who was also quoting Elder John A. Whitsoe. I heard Elder John A. Whitsoe say, "It is my observation that a young man and a young woman who violate the principles of morality soon end up hating one another." I have observed the same thing. There may be words of love to begin with, but there will be words of anger and bitterness later. And personally, in my own experience, I've also seen many a student experience that very situation. The story of Shechem and Dinah is a good illustration of this false kind of love that destroys rather than builds. Regardless of his kind words and his loving overtures afterwards. But, sorry, you just don't defile what you love. That's one of the most unromantic love stories in the book of Genesis. But let's take a look at a different couple now. Let's compare and contrast the story of Shechem and Dinah with the story of Jacob and Rachel. Their story is in Genesis 29. But let me give you a little bit of background first. Last week we studied the story of Jacob receiving the blessing that Esau thought he was supposed to get. And this makes Esau very angry with Jacob, and he vows to kill him. So Rebekah encourages him to leave and to go to Haran. But that's not the only reason he leaves. The purpose of this journey is twofold. Before he goes, Isaac instructs him to go to Rebekah's brother Laban to see if he might be able to marry one of his daughters. So Jacob leaves and makes that same 500-mile journey that we talked about last week, and eventually arrives at the fields of Laban. Remember, the worth of a covenant spouse is great. And once there, he meets a group of men surrounding a well with a stone on top of it. He finds out that he's in the right place, and they tell him that Laban's daughter Rachel is on her way to the well at that very moment to water her sheep. So let's pick up the story in verse 9. And while he yet spake with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she kept them. And it came to pass, when Jacob saw Rachel the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban his mother's brother, that Jacob went near and rolled the stone from the well's mouth, and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. And what an interesting parallel to the way that Isaac found Rebekah, and Rebekah drawing water for all of his camels. Here we have Jacob returning the favor to Laban's family by watering her sheep. Both of these stories happen at a well of water. So I sometimes tell my students that if they want to find the best potential mates, hang out by the water fountain, because that's where they apparently like to spend their time. And when Jacob sees Rachel for the first time, he's instantly smitten and reacts like a lot of young men do around girls that they're interested in. They tend to show off a little bit. So he's like, "Pardon me, little lady, but allow me to remove that stone." Yeah. And Rachel's like, "Oh, you're so strong." So, slick move, Jacob. But then he goes and blows it in the next verse. And Jacob kissed Rachel. Whoa, that's a little forward, don't you think? Slow down, Jacob. But really, this is probably more of a kiss of greeting, a common tradition in the area. But then he lifted up his voice and wept. So then he starts crying in front of her. Like, "Oh, it's so nice to meet you. You're so beautiful." Probably not the best strategy for dating, guys. But apparently in this case, it was okay, because Rachel seems to be interested in him too. Plus, that's how you feel when you meet a covenant, righteous potential spouse. It's a cause to rejoice. It's a cause to celebrate and feel deep emotion. Let's continue. And Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's brother, and that he was Rebekah's son. And she ran and told her father. And it came to pass, when Laban heard the tidings of Jacob his sister's son, that he ran to meet him, and embraced him, and kissed him. It's further proof that that initial kiss was probably just customary. And brought him to his house, and he told Laban all these things. And Laban said to him, "Surely thou art my bone and my flesh." And he abode with him the space of a month. And Laban said unto Jacob, "Because thou art my brother, shouldst thou therefore serve me for naught? Tell me, what shall thy wages be?" And Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the elder was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah was tender-eyed, but Rachel was beautiful and well-favored. And Jacob loved Rachel. So there we have that loaded word again. He loved her. That's what Shechem said about Dinah. Now, Jacob has just met her, so we can probably assume that he's feeling some attraction here. So are we just anticipating another Shechem kind of situation here? Well, let's see. Read verses 18 through 20 and tell me if you think this is an example of true love or false love that Jacob is feeling. How would you support your answer? And Jacob loved Rachel, and said, "I will serve thee 7 years for Rachel, thy younger daughter." And Laban said, "It is better that I give her to thee than that I should give her to another man. Abide with me." And Jacob served 7 years for Rachel. And then this sweet little phrase, "And they seemed unto him but a few days, for the love he had to her." And here you pause for all the female students to go, "Aw." I mean, that's got to be one of the most romantic verses in all Scripture. Is this true love? I would say yes. This is an example of real love. This is more than just affection. What does Jacob do that shows he truly loves her? He waits and he serves. True love waits and serves, as opposed to the false love of Shechem that takes and defiles. 7 years. Wow, that's a long time to court someone. But it hardly seems like a sacrifice to Jacob at all because of how much love he has for her. Where the world promotes a rush to sexual intimacy, Jacob knew the value of this relationship and was willing to wait and invest in it. And just imagine what that waiting and serving must have done for their relationship. How do you think it made Rachel feel to see Jacob out there working day after day just for the privilege of marrying her? How affirming, how beautiful, how comforting. And when they finally could be together as husband and wife, that bond of strength and unity was already forged by years of service and sacrifice. Sometimes I like to tell the young men and women that they can do the same thing as Jacob and Rachel. As teenagers, they can start working for their Rachel or their Jacob. And it'll probably be around 7 years of waiting and serving. Probably even haven't met them yet, but they're out there. So wait and serve for the privilege of marrying that individual. Don't settle for anything less. Don't rush into superficial relationships. Wait for your Rachel. Wait for your Jacob. Wait until you meet the kind of man or woman that was and is willing to wait and serve for you. Alma taught his son the true way to increase love as opposed to the world's promotion of a rush to relations. He said, "Use boldness, but not overbearance, and also see that ye bridle all your passions, that ye may be filled with love." So what word did he use to describe what we should do with our physical passions? Bridle them. Control them, as opposed to letting them run wild or have their way. The result, the promised result, that ye may be filled with love, real love. The reason we put bridles on horses isn't because they're terrible, wicked animals that need to be destroyed. Our physical passions are not bad. In fact, they're placed there by God to accomplish His divine purposes, to bring children into this world and to bring spouses closer together. So if we wish to increase love, build love, strengthen love, then we need to do what Jacob and Rachel do here in this story. Bridle, control, wait, serve until the right time, the right place, and the right circumstance. Now, what about married couples? Can this story apply to us too? You bet, yeah. Do we stop bridling passions and serving just because we're married? No. True love continues to do those things. We still have to bridle passions that may arise as life continues. A person may find themselves physically attracted to somebody else, even after they're married. Those passions have to be bridled. And we should never stop serving our spouses. It's a huge part of the definition of love the verb. I believe that when couples fall out of love, it's often because one or both has stopped serving the other. The word serve might be a better word than love to describe what we do for each other. Serve your spouse. When we stop serving our partners, love begins to die. And Jacob does do this. We'll look at the circumstances behind why in just a minute, but he does end up serving another 7 years for Rachel after he's married to her. The service didn't stop once they were married. So the truth to me in this story, these two stories, real love waits and serves, while false love takes and defiles. So like in the scriptures, what can you do now to fill your life with more real love? Here are some possible ways to answer that question. Wait and serve until you meet your Rachel or Jacob. Show more love for your spouse by serving them. End a relationship that's not based on real love. Seek God's help in bridling your passions. Or something other. And if I have time, sometimes I like to do a little activity with my students during this lesson. I have them create their own real love, false love statement. You could do it as a handout. I encourage them to fill in their own statement about real and false love and turn it in. And then we go through and read those out loud. Over the years, I've collected a number of really good ones. Here's just a few examples. Real love gets better with time. False love gets old. Real love grows in the light. False love grows in the darkness. Real love savors eternity. False love savors the moment. Real love is generous. False love is self-centered. Real love needs no confession. False love needs an explanation. Real love is hard, but worth it. False love is easy, but not. Real love loves you. False love loves itself. Aren't those great? I'm sure your students will come up with some powerful ones as well. I hope that your life is filled with love, as Alma promised there. Real love. And affection, too, of course. May you young men find your Rachels, and may you young women find your Jacobs, and live your lives deeply and consistently in real love. And in your marriages, may you find that deep unity, maintained by the will, deliberately strengthened by habit, and reinforced by God's grace that C.S. Lewis talked about. If you're teaching the youth, this can be a really good time to review the dating standards in the For the Strength of Youth pamphlet. The dating standards of the church help us to wait and serve. Testify to them of the power of following the Lord's plan for love in their life. And it's really quite simple. Don't date until you're 16. Date only those with whom you can maintain your standards. Do not have serious relationships until you're of an age that you're ready to be married. And once you are at that age, and you do enter a serious relationship, remain sexually pure with your partner. Bridle your passions. And once you're married, be completely loyal to that person for eternity. So don't fall into the rush to relationships trap. Sometimes amongst young people, it seems like having relationships is like a race. Everybody's rushing to pair off. Well, if it is a race, it's the first ones across the finish line that are the losers. Instead, bridle your passions and see how filled with love your life can be. Wait, like Jacob and Rachel did, and someday you will meet that person who you wish to spend eternity with. You'll make sacred covenants to them in a holy place, and you'll have the opportunity to experience all the joys and challenges and blessings that come with real love. That's the Lord's plan. And I can personally testify that it works. I didn't always believe it when I was a teenager, but I trusted the plan. And one day, I met my Rachel. And I'm so glad that I waited and served for her. She was and is worth it. My life, as Alma promised, is filled with love. The love that I feel for Alicia, and through that special and sacred intimate relationship that husbands and wives share, Caleb came into my life, then Braden, then Avery, then Seth. With each child, my opportunity and capacity to love has only grown exponentially. The Lord's plan works. Don't do anything that might forfeit that. Be a Jacob, be a Rachel, not a Shechem. Married couples, continue to bridle and serve your spouses. I'm certain that any marriage where both partners continue to do those two things will be happy and eternal in nature. Now, as wonderful and exciting as falling in love and dating and marriage is, there is still reality to consider here. Marriage and family life is not all bliss and sunshine and roses. All marriages and families face challenges and difficulties. We're going to see that even with Jacob and Rachel's romantic and inspiring start. Their marriage relationship is going to encounter some real testing right from the get-go. I know I've already expressed that Genesis is an important book for families. It's full of examples of different kinds of marriages and families with different problems and challenges. Dysfunctional may even be the modern word we might use to describe some of them. So for an icebreaker activity, see if you can match the family from Genesis with the challenges they face. From what you know about them, what adversities do you see them encounter? Some of the challenges have more than one answer. And I think this activity can quickly help us to realize just how relevant this ancient book of Scripture is to our modern families. These people have a lot to teach us. And let's go over some answers. I'm sure I'm possibly missing something here, but here are some of the connections that you can make. For parenting a wayward child, you've got Adam and Eve that experienced this, Lot and his wife, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Rachel. They all have children with problems. And these are great parents. Having wayward children doesn't make you a bad parent. It's a challenge that many righteous parents have. Contention between siblings. Lots of this in Genesis. Cain and Abel, Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Esau, Rachel and Leah, Joseph and his brothers. Quite a few sibling rivalries in Genesis. Infertility. Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Rachel will all face this challenge. Separation or divorce. Abraham and Hagar will experience this. Raising children as a single parent. We talked about this a few weeks ago. Hagar faces that challenge. Living with a spouse that doesn't seem to love you. Leah has that kind of marriage. We'll talk more about her later. Trying to raise children in a wicked environment. Now, I guess they all could fit into that category, but more particularly, Noah and Lot and their wives come to mind. Trouble with in-laws. I know a lot of people who have this challenge. Jacob is a really good example with that, as we see him interact with Laban, Rachel and Leah's father. And then death of a spouse. Abraham loses Sarah. Lot loses his wife. Jacob loses Rachel. Now, can you or your families relate to any of those problems that are listed there? I can imagine that most families are going to face at least one, if not multiple, items from that list. Genesis covers a lot of different things. So, therefore, we can all learn something about facing family challenges from this book. I invite you to look for those lessons as we study. For this week, let's zero in on some of the family problems that Jacob is going to face, and some of the solutions that we can find in these chapters. First, the problems. One of the major sources, if not the major source of the problems that Jacob is going to face in his family life, is going to stem from what happens in Genesis 29, 21 to 30. Read those verses and tell me, in one word, what you would identify as the problem. What is it? My answer? Deceit. The deceit of Laban here is going to cause a lot of future problems for this family. Jacob has worked for 7 years to marry Rachel. He loves Rachel. And so the day of the wedding arrives, and Laban surreptitiously gives him Leah on the honeymoon night instead of Rachel. And I don't quite know how to explain how that all worked and went down. Veiled faces, it was dark in the tent, I don't know. But verse 25, and it came to pass that in the morning, behold, it was Leah. And he said to Laban, What is this thou hast done unto me? Did not I serve with thee for Rachel? Wherefore then hast thou beguiled me? To be fair, there is just a bit of poetic justice in this situation. Now Jacob knows what it feels like to be on the receiving end of a deceit where someone pretends to be someone else, like he did with impersonating Esau. Not quite the same thing, but similar. And, Jacob is going to marry Rachel. Verse 30. And he went in also unto Rachel, and he loved also Rachel more than Leah, and served with him yet 7 other years. But Jacob never intended to work for Leah. This deceit is going to set up all the problems that we'll see between Jacob and Rachel and Leah in the coming chapters. That problem is going to continue through their children. That situation is going to set up the Joseph story as that rivalry between sisters becomes a rivalry between their children. And that's going to lead them to sell Joseph, Rachel's child, into Egypt. And therefore, Jacob loves Rachel more than Leah. Now, who do you blame most for that situation? I blame Laban. In his enthusiasm to marry off his daughters, he sets them all up for trouble. Can you blame Jacob for this? No, of course he loves Rachel more than Leah. He'll work 14 years for her. You can't force love. Do you blame Leah? No, at least not as much as Laban. We don't know how much of a say that she had in this thing, but I guess that she was at least willing to go along with it. I really feel sorry for her. How would it feel to know that your husband was tricked into marrying you? Then you feel bad for Rachel. I'm sure she doesn't want to share her husband with her sister. Would you? So the problem is deceit. Lying and deceit will always cause problems in families. So spouses, be honest with your partners. Don't hide things from each other. Don't tell lies. Children, be honest with your parents. Don't hide things from them. Tell the truth. Siblings, be honest with each other. The more deceit that we have within families, the more contention there's going to be. Now read chapter 29, verses 31 to 35, to find the problem that the initial problem of Laban's deceit sets up. And when the Lord saw that Leah was hated, and that's a bad translation, I would say less favored would probably be a more accurate term. And that makes sense. He's not in love with Leah. He opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. And Leah conceived and bare a son, and she called his name Reuben, for she said, Surely the Lord hath looked upon my affliction. Now therefore my husband will love me. Isn't that heartbreaking? I really feel for Leah here. She's in a loveless marriage. I think there's probably a lot of Leahs out there in the world. For whatever reason, these relationships may have started out with passion and love, but there are spouses out there who don't feel that connection or appreciation from their partners. That's hard. It's a huge challenge. So Leah is going to struggle and hope for that attention from Jacob. And perhaps, instead of trying to get the passion that he feels for Rachel from Jacob, she hopes to at least get his appreciation by bearing children. And this is where we start what I call the baby derby, right? The sisters and their handmaids, who Jacob also marries, begin to bear children. And it's almost like a competition between the two. Now, I'm not going to take the time to go through all the births and names of the children, but I invite you to do so. Read chapter 29, 31 to 35, and chapter 30, verses 1 through 24 for the story. But be sure to take note of what the boys' names mean in the footnotes. It's really sad. Their names reflect the conflict within the family. Here's just a few examples. It's like with Reuben, it means, look, a son. Or, look, Jacob, I've borne you a son now. Love me. Naphtali means wrestling. And that's a sad one. Rachel says, with great wrestlings have I wrestled with my sister, and I have prevailed. Gad means a troop, which was Leah's way of saying, look, Rachel, at my troop of 6 children I've borne for Jacob. Beat that. And it kind of goes on like that through all the children. Now, Leah is going to win the baby derby in the end. She will, and also with her handmaid, have 9 children compared to Rachel's 3. But what's the problem here? What's going on between these two sisters? Competition. The spirit of competition will always cause conflict and difficulties within families, whether that rivalry comes between spouses or siblings. It can be the source of great trouble. I work harder than you. You're not doing enough. I make more money for the family. I'm prettier, more athletic, smarter than you. Mom and Dad love me more. The spirit of comparing and competition can really hamper happiness within a family. All of this is really a sad situation. It's tough on Jacob. It's tough on Leah. It's tough on Rachel. And really, it's Laban's fault for the most part. Sometimes the challenging circumstances that we face as families come through no fault of our own. Disease, accidents, financial stress, the actions of in-laws, environmental factors, victimization from others. All of these things can cause real complications for relationships. So what's a family to do? Let's talk solutions now. The scriptures never present problems without solutions. And so I can see some things within these chapters that can help us face these kinds of family challenges. Now, some of the solutions are implied from the problems. We've already discussed some of those. So one of the solutions is to be honest with each other. We've learned that deceit can cause major problems within families. And another, don't get caught up in the spirit of competition. What can we do instead? I think the implied solution between Rachel and Leah would be empathy. Have empathy for the struggles and the desires of our family members. Don't rub their problems or shortcomings in their faces. If you have a gift or success that they lack, be compassionate and understanding with that. Take a quick look at chapter 30, verse 1. And when Rachel saw that she bare Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister. I mean, we do feel bad for Rachel here. She wants to have children and she can't. But then, don't you want to say, but Rachel, your sister envies you too. Don't you think she feels bad in this situation? She envies the kind of relationship that you share with Jacob. She just wants to be loved like that too. And then to Leah, you want to say, can't you see how hard this is for Rachel? Being able to have all these children with Jacob should not be something you lord over her or boast of. This is hard for her. I think this problem between the sisters could have better been dealt with if each were a bit more willing to be empathetic with the other. Rachel could have recognized how hard this was for her sister to be married to a man that never really intended to marry her, and Leah could have recognized how hard it must have been for her sister not to be able to have children. I think empathy and understanding can go a long way in helping to resolve family conflicts. Hopefully we can put ourselves in their shoes and act accordingly. Now see if you can find a third and fourth solution in the following verses. What do you see happening in 31 verses 4 through 5 and 14 through 16? In those verses, you see all three of them, Jacob, Rachel, and Leah, working through a family challenge together. And both Rachel and Leah respond and contribute to coming up with a solution. What we may be witnessing here is an early family council taking place. Families can overcome problems as they seek to counsel with each other and work to find solutions. I love that all three of them are included in this big family decision of what to do about Laban's displeasure with Jacob. Jacob doesn't make the decision unilaterally. They counsel together. How about in Genesis 32, 9 through 11? Do you see a solution there? Jacob includes somebody else in his decisions. God. Prayer is a solution to family problems. As the family decides to return to Jacob's homeland in Canaan, he stops to pray at Bethel once again, that special place that he encountered when he first left. And I like the word that is used to describe the nature of this prayer in verse 24. He wrestled with God. This isn't a physical struggle, although it says in the next verses that his thigh goes out of joint, so maybe that was some prayer. But he really prays with great fervor and earnestness. When it comes to our family problems, if we turn to God and wrestle with those issues with great diligence and fervor, God can step in and help us with those things. And he does. He does answer Jacob's prayer, and he helps him. I think that truth is also reflected in what God does for the sisters in their struggles. Remember 29:31? And when the Lord saw that Leah was hated, he opened her womb. But Rachel was barren. I think the Lord understands Leah's struggle, and so he gives her this compensatory grace to help her. I think that suggests that she's been praying for help in this situation. The Lord answers her prayers. Now, I don't think he's necessarily solving the Jacob's love issue for her. I don't think Jacob's ever going to feel about Leah the way that he feels about Rachel. But he is going to do something for her that will help, that will be a blessing in her life. And I'm not ready to say that God causes Rachel's barrenness at this point. I just think that's a challenge that she happens to face, that many women face in life. But later, in Genesis 30:22, and God remembered Rachel, and God hearkened to her, and opened her womb. So Rachel's been praying too, and God remembers and hears her, and she's blessed. God offers her a compensatory grace too. She's never going to have as many children as Leah does, but she does have children. I believe that in many problems couples face, God can step in and bless and help. He may not solve every problem that we wish him to, or in the way that we wish him to, but he helps. He remembers. He hears. He can do things for us that will ease the pain and hardship. There's one more solution that I want to talk about today. And to me, it's probably the biggest, the most important solution to family problems. Let's talk about Esau again. I told you last week that his story wasn't over. He still has a very significant lesson to teach us. I know we kind of hold him up as an example of what not to do. Don't be like Esau. Don't sell your birthright for pottage. But there's a lot more to this man than you might think. The story of Jacob and Esau is also one of sibling rivalry. And is that problem ever going to be solved? How were things left between the two brothers the last we heard of Esau? Go back to Genesis 27:41. And Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing wherewith his father blessed him. And Esau said in his heart, the days of mourning for my father are at hand. Then will I slay my brother Jacob. And these words of Esau, her elder son, were told to Rebekah. And she sent and called Jacob her younger son, and said unto him, Behold, thy brother Esau, as touching thee, doth comfort himself, purposing to kill thee. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice. Arise, flee thou to Laban my brother, to Haran. You better get out of town, Jacob. Esau's planning to kill you. Run. So he does. So Jacob leaves, and instead of being gone for a few days, he's gone for more like 20 years as he gets caught up in serving 14 for Rachel and then getting married and starting his family. All these events that we've been talking about. But eventually, in chapter 31, after he's had 12 children, 11 sons and 1 daughter, God has an instruction for him. And the Lord said unto Jacob, Return unto the land of thy fathers and to thy kindred, and I will be with thee. Now that's a bit concerning to Jacob. He knows he's been blessed with both the birthright and the blessing. But Esau is still there. Last time he saw his brother, he wanted to kill him. And for Jacob to return is more than just a homecoming. The very act of coming back would send the message to Esau that he was coming to inherit his birthright and his blessing. So Esau, it's time for you to leave. This is my inheritance. That's the implied message of Jacob's return. So he's got a lot of reason to be worried. And you see that anxiety as he travels. That's when he prays and wrestles with God. It's why he's praying so hard. He's worried that Esau will attack and kill him and his family. So when he's close to the land, he asks some of his servants to go and tell Esau that he's coming. Test the waters a bit. And those servants come back with a very troubling scenario. And the messengers return to Jacob, saying, We came to thy brother Esau, and also he cometh to meet thee, and 400 men with him. Uh-oh, this can't be good. Esau is coming with 400 men. He must still be angry. He's going to come. He's going to attack me. Verse 7, Then Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed. And then he prays. Now what's going to happen? Will God preserve him from the apparent anger of Esau? Chapter 33 depicts a very dramatic moment in Scripture. I want you to picture it. Here comes Jacob with all of his family. And we learn in Genesis 32, verses 13 through 18, that Jacob sends a large gift of cattle and camels and sheep in front of him. hoping to appease Esau. But let's read this moment. And as a teacher, go slowly. Really build this up. Is there going to be a fight? Is Jacob going to have to battle with his brother? Will God have to swoop in and protect him in a miraculous way? Let's see. And Jacob lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau came, and with him 400 men. And he divided the children unto Leah, and unto Rachel, and unto the 2 handmaids. And he put the handmaids and their children foremost, and Leah and her children after, and Rachel and Joseph hindermost. And he passed over before them, and bowed himself to the ground 7 times, until he came near to his brother. Oh, what's going to happen? And Esau ran to meet him, and embraced him, and fell on his neck, and kissed him, and they wept. If you've never heard this story before, it's probably not what you were expecting, was it? It's one of the most beautiful scenes of reconciliation and forgiveness in the whole Bible. In fact, that language mirrors the language that Jesus is going to use in the parable of the prodigal son, when his father runs to meet him and falls on his neck and kisses him. Esau has forgiven him. Kind of like the prodigal son. He's changed. He's not angry with Jacob. He's overjoyed to see him after all those years. I love Esau for this, because from his perspective, I can kind of understand him being angry with Jacob. But he's willing to let bygones be bygones. He recognizes what's most important here: family and his relationship with his brother. Can you see those brothers out there on the plains, hugging each other and weeping? It's a wonderful, hope-infused scene. And it even gets better. After Jacob introduces Esau to his family, to Uncle Esau, Esau asks, "What meanest thou by all this drove which I met?" All the cattle and everything. And he said, "These are to find grace in the sight of my Lord." And Esau said, "I have enough, my brother. Keep that thou hast unto thyself. You don't need to do that. I'm good. I'm just happy to see you again." And Jacob said, "Nay, I pray thee, if now I have found grace in thy sight, then receive my present at my hand. For therefore I have seen thy face, as though I had seen the face of God. And thou wast pleased with me. I didn't think it would turn out like this. This is too good to be true. Take, I pray thee, my blessing that is brought to thee, because God hath dealt graciously with me, and because I have enough." And he urged him, and he took it. All right, Jacob, if you insist. I love that description. Seeing the face of forgiveness in a family member is like seeing the face of God himself. Why? Because forgiveness is not only beautiful, it's divine. Mercy is a godly trait. And then I love that later in Genesis 35:29, Isaac dies, but both of the boys bury their father together. And then Esau leaves. He leaves the land to Jacob. Genesis 36:6. And Esau took his wives and his sons and his daughters and all the persons of his house, and his cattle and all his beasts and all his substance which he had got in the land of Canaan, and went into the country from the face of his brother Jacob. He doesn't fight him for it. He doesn't continue to accuse Jacob of stealing his birthright and his blessing. He accepts Jacob as the inheritor and has the humility to recognize that Jacob didn't really steal that blessing, that he earned it. I really love Esau. He's one of my favorite characters in all of Genesis. He teaches us the power of forgiveness. Personally, despite the foibles of his youth, I believe there's a place in the celestial kingdom for Esau. I do. This scene of forgiveness, I feel, is as equally as powerful as another forgiveness story that we're going to see later in Genesis with Joseph and his brothers. Apparently, this is a principle that God really wanted to emphasize in his first book of Scripture. What is that message, that truth? Always forgive others, especially members of your own family. Maybe this scene can offer some hope for some individuals out there who are having some conflicts in their own families. Maybe Esau out there hugging Jacob can give you some inspiration. Sometimes it just takes one person to reach out to the other in mercy and forgiveness and reconciliation. So to liken the scriptures, which do you find harder to do? Extending or accepting an apology? What have you found helpful in healing strained family relationships? Do any of your family relationships need reconciliation? How could you follow the example of Esau? And we could add this solution to our other family solutions and ask, have one of these solutions ever blessed you and your family? Would you be willing to share your experience? So in conclusion, whatever your family circumstance is or the challenges you face, hopefully the book of Genesis can offer help. Perhaps Genesis can dispel the myth that families within the church are perfect. I don't believe anybody has a perfect family or marriage. We've all got difficulties and hardships to overcome in our family relationships. But God doesn't leave us to face these things alone. That's the advantage the faithful have in these situations. There's a lot of things that we can do to overcome them. When they come, I hope we can remember to turn to our Heavenly Father in prayer and seek His compensatory graces. We can counsel together. We can be honest with each other. We can seek to empathize rather than to compete. And, as Esau so powerfully taught us, we can seek to forgive. Perhaps the next time we find ourselves on the receiving end of deceit, offense, or betrayal, and the offending party reaches out to us in apologetic contrition, that we'll remember Esau and seek healing and reconciliation. And that's all I have for you today, my friends. Thank you so much for joining me. If you're interested in the resources that I make for teachers, the handouts, the slides, the lesson plans, go to teachingwithpower.com and you'll find links to all those resources there. The best thing you can do if you found this lesson helpful is to share it with somebody else that you feel that it could help. Thank you so much for watching. Now get out there and teach with power.